Assets at IIDS, and we welcome you all to this very important event. We're very honored to do this in collaboration with the World Bank. This important activity, if some of you remember, started last year when some of you actually were part of a brainstorming session. Subsequent to that, Sajitha and Klaus have worked very hard this whole last year, preparing a report, and this is what they will be presenting today. The purpose is to get everybody's feedback, particularly the feedback of the expert panel that is assembled here, so that we look at the relevance of these findings from this very important piece for Nepal, so that it becomes relevant for us, for the government and for the development partners. Personally, I've been reviewing the document. It's extremely broad, but it's also deep, and it's also coherent. So it's taking quite a bit of time for me to understand all the different aspects of it, but it's been a tremendously, learning experience, because with IT, certainly for someone like me, it's all been bits and pieces. And this piece brings it all together for us. I want to, before I introduce Sajitha and Klaus, I want to welcome our partners and guests. First of all, I don't know if Renee is here, and I know that Lada Strelkova, who is the operations manager for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, will also be joining us. But I think she's going to be joining a little bit later, but Renee hopefully is here. Renee Solano, who is the practice leader for...
yes, I'm here.
Great. For HD, for human development for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Welcome. Welcome also to our panel of experts. We have 13 of you, and I'll just name you. It's important to name you because also from the point of view of you get the first say when you get started, when we get started with respect to the discussions. They're all an extremely esteemed group of individuals who have had tremendous impact already in the country and abroad in some cases. We have Dr. Swarnim Wagle, who does not need any introduction. He's going to be talking very broadly. We will give him the floor as the first startup when the discussion starts. Former Vice Chancellor of the National Planning Commission, Dr. Bishal Dhakal in the area of health, Ms. Sumana Shrestha, post-crisis innovation / health, Ms. Lamo Yanchen Sherpa in the area of health as well, Dr. Pratibha Pandey, innovation and tech, Dr. Arniko Pandey in the area of climate change, Mr. Bal Joshi, e-commerce and fintech, Mr. Sikshit Bhatta, infrastructure, Mr. Asghar Ali in IT, Ms. Karvika Thapa in IT, Professor Timila Yami Thapa in IT, Mr. Anand K. Khanal in telecom. Very pleased that he's able to join us. He was heading the National Telecommunications Board and currently with the Ministry of Communication, I think it's called. And Dr. Mahavir Pun in the area of technology and innovation. So all of them extremely esteemed guests and panelists, and we hope to hear from them. They have already received prior copies of the presentation, so we hope they've come with their feedback on it. I also want to welcome, of course, our chairman. I just already mentioned Dr. Wagle, but also Dr. Biswas Kauchan, our executive director from IIDS, has kindly joined us, and he will be making some closing remarks. Moving on to introducing Sajitha and Klaus, let me read from their brief bios. Dr. Sajitha Bashir is advisor in the Office of Global Director of the Education Practice in the World Bank. She currently leads the work on digital skills as part of the digital economy initiatives of the World Bank and on using technology for accelerating human capital outcomes in South Asia. Formerly, she was education practice manager responsible for over 20 countries. In Africa, she pioneered the World Bank's support for science and technology in Africa. Her initiatives include financing the Africa Centers of Excellence regional project and establishing the first Pan-African Science Fund with contributions from African governments, the World Bank donors, and private sector, called the PASET. I was very fortunate to be part of Sajitha's team when I was still at the bank in, I think, all of these initiatives in one way or another. She is the co-author of Facing Forward, Schooling for Learning in Africa, a flagship study of the World Bank on the quality of basic education in Africa. She has worked on Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and Middle East, and holds a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics. Klaus Tilmes. Klaus served as director of the Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice of the World Bank. Working with the president's office, he helped develop a new approach on disruptive technologies. He's currently engaged on sustainability issues of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and as senior fellow at the African Center for Economic Transformation. So welcome to both our speakers. We are looking forward to a great presentation. With respect to the process, this is what will happen. There will be the presentation for about 45 minutes. For about 45 minutes, after which we will get on to feedback from our panelists, the expert panelists. And we will start with Swarnim Wagle, but then open the floor after that to any of you in the panel that will raise your hand. And we will just do it verbally. We're not going to take, we can take comments on the chat, but that will not be the modality. The modality will be just raise your hand. And by raising your hand, I mean the Google hand, not the Zoom hand, the yellow hand. And we will just call on you. And then after that, that'll go on for about half an hour, 35 minutes from just the panelists, after which we will open it for open discussion and questions as well for all of you others who have joined us until around 7:50 Nepal time, at which point we will request Lada Strelkova to, hopefully by that she'll have joined to make some closing remarks, and then also our executive director, Dr. Gauchan, will give some closing remarks and vote of thanks. So that's how we will proceed. If you cannot get your message across or your questions across, do send us comments on the chat, and then we will collect those and send them to Sajitha and Klaus, and we might get those responses back later on after the event. So that's how we will proceed. Without further lengthening this thing, I would ask now Sajitha to take the floor and go from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. Hope you can hear me. Just, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Arun, and colleagues of the IIDS, colleagues of the World Bank, or colleagues in Nepal, namaskar. I'm going to start sharing my screen and hope that you can see that. So I just want to go over the structure of the presentation very briefly. We will first cover the nature of the converging technology revolution, the relationship between human capital and technology, and there are 3 pillars of our framework: build and protect, deploy and utilize, and empower human capital. We'll also cover the technology landscape in South Asia, the findings from our study structured around these 3 pillars. But we'll go over it very quickly because we will then deal specifically with the current landscape in Nepal, which was not reflected in detail in our study since it's a regional study, but we have done some additional work for this workshop in particular in order to contextualize the findings. And finally, we discuss a little bit how we should engage around the technology entry points. The study began in the early stages of the pandemic last year, around March or so. And these were the 4 questions that we framed to respond to the South Asia Human Development Management team. And we will be covering these, as I said. The specific part that we'll not be presenting is so much what is the World Bank currently doing and how should we be engaging, because that could be discussed later. But we felt that as we finished the study, the findings became actually more and more relevant, not only for the current pandemic, but for future pandemics and for the climate change crises that South Asia would be facing. And we felt that obviously that this is a much broader engagement than just using specific technologies or apps and so on. And I think the unfolding situation in India currently regarding the second wave of the pandemic only highlights how important it is to have the basic human capital infrastructure, the health infrastructure, education infrastructure, and so on. But at the same time, as we rebuild this infrastructure, we can use this converging technology revolution to make sure that we address the deep inequalities that are there in South Asia. So let me first start with how we viewed this converging technology revolution. And it's important to highlight this framework because many times when we think of technology, we think of the IT revolution, or we think of what is called as the digital revolution. And we wish to highlight that, in fact, there's a convergence of multiple technologies. Now, that concept is not new. That's dating at least from 2002, from the National Science Foundation, OECD, and so on. That is the convergence of nanotechnology, the creation of new materials, and so on that can actually be developed to serve particular needs, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive technologies, the understanding of how the human mind works. But what is new about this in the current period is the fact that you have ubiquitous connectivity, or the potential of that, big data with high volume, velocity, different types of data, and of course, the data that has become valuable in itself, and high-speed computing, all of which allows the convergence of these technologies to be powered by artificial intelligence. Again, a kind of general purpose technology that was there before, in fact, from the, people have been talking about it from the 50s and 60s, but it's only now with the availability of masses of data and the ability to analyze that and to find deep patterns in the data through ubiquitous connectivity that this has now become a reality. Now, there's a huge potential for human capital, obviously. We see it in the development of the COVID-19 vaccine itself, the biotechnologies itself, the rapid genomic sequencing of the virus. In certain of the vaccines, definitely the use of, nanoparticles to deliver the mRNA, to the cells. And information technology, of course, has been used at all stages. And increasingly, this is powered by AI. In agriculture, you see fantastic advances, synthetic biology, embedded plant sensors that can actually communicate with electronic devices, and then the regular sensors and so on that can lead to sensing what moisture and irrigation is required, machine-to-machine interaction, robots, drones, and so on. And in the human development field, we also see many cases, but a kind of spooky example that we covered in our paper, background paper, is how adaptive learning is now being developed by edtech companies, focusing on the cognitive sciences that link emotion and learning, and sensors that capture facial expressions and even body parameters, and AI-based affective computing, which kind of delivers so-called personalized learning depending on your learning style, but also exactly how you feel at that time. I mean, at least allegedly, that's the potential. But from this, we can go to the issue that many of these converging technologies are also dual use. That is, they have a beneficial purpose, but can be misused. But more importantly, with the connection of many types of technologies and so on, and with ubiquitous connectivity with large data flows, you actually are moving to a scenario of converging threats, and here the converging threats center around two types of threats, I would say. One relating to data and the fact that sensitive data can be extracted from multiple uses of these technologies. You can have data poisoning, you can have algorithmic prediction of behavior. And the second set of threats relates to bias, exclusion, and disempowerment. And I think these are very important things to consider as we move forward. Now, a second framework relates to how do we understand the relationship between human capital and technology. Now, if you look at the center box, we kind of designate the life cycle of human capital from early years, and that is even predating birth, to working life and beyond. And the first set of relationships is that technologies in the human development sectors can contribute to building human capital. That is, for instance, maternal and reproductive health, vaccines, technology for learning, social assistance, etc. But there are also technologies in agriculture, water, environment, and so on, which will contribute to human capital. They're not outside the traditional HD sectors. But since these technologies are developing, they can have a powerful impact on building and protecting human capital. But another aspect, however, of technologies is the fact that people work in the economic system and technologies are used in the productive system. So whether human capital is deployed, and how it is deployed, how that is impacted by the technology that is used in the economic system is extremely significant. And another aspect of it is the specialized human capital that that drives the innovation and tech ecosystem. That is scientists, technologists, and so on. But there's a reverse link also, which is shown by the fourth arrow. That is that it's that system which then generates new technologies or adaptations of technologies for both the HD sectors as well as the contributing sectors. So summarizing this, we define on the left side the three pillars of the human capital framework: build and protect, deploy and utilize, and empower. And the theory of change, which is saying how these technologies affect the human capital goals. I should also mention that as we were doing this study, the South Asia region was developing its human capital acceleration plan, and it already identified that one of the key features in South Asia is the stark inequalities in human capital accumulation, low levels, but stark inequalities, and the lack of public investment, in fact, in human capital. So what do we find then, quickly covering the South Asia landscape, is that if we look at what we're calling build and protect human capital through technologies that enhance human development service delivery in South Asia. What we see is that there is a fundamental transition from individual technology tools, whether they're digital and non-digital, to these digital platforms and use of machine learning, AI, and so on. Overall, the private sector is leading these innovations, okay? And of course, there are big differences across countries and across sectors. We see the converging technology revolution advancing most rapidly in the health sector because it's aligned with global trends. I mean, you'll have robotic surgery in South Asia if robotic surgery exists in the world. So there's a tremendous convergence, you can say, across the world. Here we are using convergence in a different sense, but they're led by global pharma, global medical device firms, also global big tech, right? And local technology conglomerates. They're also local technology startups. In ed tech, on the other hand, education technology, there isn't so much of the global convergence because there has to be much greater localization due to national curricula. It's largely business to consumer, led by private sector for private students, private schools, etc., mainly in English. And the main focus is still on exam and test preparation. Okay. Now, the other aspects that we covered in this segment about the tech landscape in South Asia for service delivery is that despite this enormous potential and the growth in the private sector, what we are calling the first mile digital access, that is the access to households or to the schools and health centers at what is called the periphery, is actually very low and varies from between 13 to 35%. There's gaps of 20 to 50% between rich and poor in terms of key indicators like, access to fixed internet, access to a computer, knowledge of the internet, and so on. And content is lacking in local languages. We call this first mile. Our IT colleagues, both in the bank and other places, call it last mile. But we think from HD point of view, it's really important to call this first mile. Public sector platforms are lagging, and in HD sectors in particular, they exist in many places, but they're lagging. And there's minimal use of, the huge number of data sets that could be used for HD service delivery, in particular geospatial and other data sets that could be used for optimization, for targeting, and for improving the quality and efficiency of HD service delivery. The potential exists, the actual practice is very limited. And data protection and use is largely unregulated. We'll deal this a bit more later. Over collection and lack of protection of data on children, women, vulnerable groups, and a completely unregulated role of data brokers in the sale and use of data. When we look at the deploy and utilize pillar of the human capital framework in South Asia, what do we see? I mean, if we take about 4 points, one is there is a great potential for job disruption, definitely. New technologies are changing existing industries, especially, ready-made garment industry in Bangladesh. But there's also new jobs being created, the new kind of service delivery kind of services powered by technology and powered by digital platforms. The scale of adoption, however, varies across countries, across industries, depending on the maturity of the technologies, the incentives, the market profitability, and so on. And still, the HD sectors, even in the private sector, are relatively less technology infused, one might say. Technology diffusion is limited by the relatively low stock of specialized human capital. We show how, leaving aside India, the other countries have limited specialized human capital. Even India, in relation to, for instance, China and others, is still relatively small. And when you look at the innovation ecosystem, you see that it is being led globally by large tech companies or large health firms and so on, and increasingly being driven by big data and AI, and local innovation capacity is kind of falling behind, but needs to be built. If they don't have the capacities in these areas, then you'll have this big gap between what is being developed globally and whether it can be adapted and used locally, or even whether it serves the needs. Now, finally, we deal with the question of empowerment, and I'm going to spend a few slides on this because we do think this is an important aspect of technology, which is often ignored, but it is essential, we think, in the context of human capital, because it must empower the marginalized groups, women, girls, and reduce exclusion and inequalities. Our human capital plan for South Asia focuses on that, and therefore technologies must help to reduce the inequalities and must help to improve empowerment and agency of these groups. Now, we deal with three aspects: trust, data rights, and overall technology governance. And this may sound a little surprising. Why do you bring up the question of trust when you're talking of technologies? Actually, trust is very fundamental to the use of technologies. And essentially, our review of the literature says that it's a function of whether people feel it solves their problems or not. What complicates things is if people feel it's being used to either identify them personally or for targeting a group, and it is also embedded in the overall socio-political system. Now, we see that in the context of the pandemic, on misinformation and the use of digital IDs and apps and so on, the enormous amount of mistrust that is generated and which hampers the deployment of technologies. And the sad reality is that in South Asia, trust is clearly undermined by an invasive private and public data collection through platform apps, which is especially dangerous in education, health, social protection, and so on. Large-scale misinformation, and data invisibility. That's the flip side of it, that if you don't have digital access, the marginalized groups can actually become data invisible. They're not used by the AI. They're not available for public policy purposes. And in fact, this then deepens the structural inequalities in human capital and power asymmetries that already exist. And quickly on data rights, I mean, the World Development Report on data takes a rights-based approach to data, and it enshrines the principle that personal data is not owned, but rather is an extension of oneself. That has implications on how you treat data legally, issues of data colonialism, but the main thing is legal protection, which must focus on issues of proportionality, purpose limitations, and data minimization. But law cannot prescribe everything, and therefore data ethics is extremely important. Now, when we look at data governance in South Asia, overall it's very weak. And Nepal is a bit of an exception, actually. It has a Privacy Act which meets the standards, you know. Now, implementation may be a different issue, but most of the other countries either have nothing or have something which provide for a lot of exceptions for government surveillance, national security, a low burden of proof, etc. And I just close this section with an example from AI in education. You know, we looked at examples where we can deal with two sets of issues: data collection, ownership, use, and protection. Who owns the data? Who can use it? Who is legally responsible for data security? Can the private data then be used and sold and used for profiling and so on? What does informed consent mean, etc.? And then you have the problem of perpetuating bias and existing inequalities, the lack of transparency of AI algorithms. How do you have mechanisms to review such biases, and so on? So with this, I'll hand over to Klaus to deal with, to present on Nepal. Over to you, Klaus.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sajitha. When we looked at Nepal, the part that probably comes to mind first is that Nepal has rapidly made progress in terms of wirelessly connecting to the internet. At the same time, this is sort of a catch-up game because if you compare Nepal relative to the world, you can see that there's still quite a gap. The second aspect is that the connection that Nepal enjoys to the internet are hampered by a slow download, frequent outages, and actually for mobile broadband, fairly expensive. In fact, the average cost for mobile broadband for Nepali users are about 1.5 times global averages. Inequality is a defining characteristic in terms of digital access, particularly as it affects and hinders the opportunities for women and girls. Based on the latest numbers that we were able to find, mobile ownership disadvantages women by 80% and internet access by 40%. There's also a pervasive lack of gender-based violence protection. Something that we find is very important, not enough female participation in the development of ICT policies, and also a lack of gender disaggregated data. So if you don't have that data, of course, it's very difficult to really report on improvements. And unfortunately, as much of the world has experienced, but South Asia in particular, COVID has widened these inequality gaps, urban, rural, rich and poor. Returning migrants are finding it difficult to actually fit into the system of social assistance. And there is sort of this general effort or this general perception that while digital may have helped, rural areas, healthcare, schools, and vocational training programs really were particularly hard hit. Next slide, please. In terms of the COVID response, the positive part is that there are growing opportunities that are seen for the government of Nepal to promote digital adoption in domestic markets. And in fact, particularly in urban areas, digital use by consumers and by local business has increased. And it has also led to an important push for government to launch these broad-based reforms, something that this particular group, and I remember our conversation almost 10 months ago, was really calling for. It is not for lack of plan. The plan goes all the way back to 2018 or 19. It is now really time to implement this plan. And a very important factor to make this possible is the digital capacity and the data literacy, both on the consumer side, but also on the side of government. And I've heard sort of in the initial pre-presentation conversation, the ecosystem for innovation is nascent. It has a lot of growth potential, but there's limits in terms of venture funding, of technology incubators, of mentor networks. And as we heard last time, some of the big catalysts are actually coming from diaspora entrepreneurs and migrants that serve as catalysts. Something that has happened, particularly over the last couple of months, is the rapid expansion of digital financial inclusion, which I think overall globally is seen as a key pathways for digital access, for improving financial literacy, and for targeting assistance. Many digital programs across the countries have taken off, but the challenge, I think, particularly in Nepal, is how do you integrate all of these different lessons? Is there too much of piloting? And how do we also focus particularly on those programs that are important for giving girls and women a chance to participate in this? Next, please. In terms of the technology landscape for human development services, something that still is probably the #1 scale-up constraint is the lack of a nationwide unique digital ID system, despite some of the limitations that Sajitha has already mentioned. Not having this limits the targeting of social services. It risks exclusion, particularly of rural population in isolated areas. And just to bring this forward, 17% of Nepalis are currently not registered, and of those, 70% are women. So again, the bias, I think, within the system is fairly pronounced against women. Now, the government is planning a huge expansion of digital platforms and initiatives. We counted, there are about 7 in health, 8 in education, a wide range and a very diverse and very ambitious plan, from management information system, health facilities, electronic health records, government to government portals. So the future really is one of, we know what we want to do, now we have to figure out how to implement it. And from an HD point of view, of course, a really important part is how do we make sure that the digital skills are part and parcel of this digital rollout. And there are quite a number of local programs that have been started. I mentioned a few of them here on the slide, but they really currently remain largely disconnected. And another point that was mentioned even 10 months ago was the question of how do we use digital job matching in the labor market to ensure that there's actually more take-up. So in some way, there's sort of the disconnect is between having a platform and then not actually being able to effectively use it. Final point, a very important one, is who is actually promoting the data transparency that is so critical for this digital transformation. And Open Data Nepal is a very interesting group that we looked at. And at the same time, it also suggests that the publication of government data sets and digital government services is something that really would benefit from scaling up and accelerating. Next. In terms of Nepal's trust, data rights, and governance issue, as Sajitha mentioned, Nepal is sort of the shining example of recognizing early on the individual privacy protections. And we have heard, particularly in the health system, for instance, in the health area, that is actually quite taken quite seriously. Now, at the same time, we have also heard that the sale of personal data through messaging and social media are actually quite popular, frequent, available at low cost. So having an individual privacy act is definitely not a safe and final word on data protection. And in fact, data protection and cybersecurity are two very important aspects that I think there is definitely concern that both areas need to be updated. There's specialized expertise that is needed. The vulnerabilities and the biases associated with not having them are going to become ever more prominent. And having enabling policies and regulations that would also allow to anticipate new technologies and safeguard against the negative consequences, really one of the warning signs and warning signals that we want to send through the study. Over to you.
Okay, so summing up the previous section, if you wanted to go away with just a few key messages, let's say that the converging technology revolution is not in the future in South Asia, it's happening right now. It is largely led by the private sector. It is happening to a certain extent in the human development sector. We say that you need the human capital framework to understand the linkages between technology and human capital. The public sector has to catch up, and it needs to invest in certain things, capabilities, as well as infrastructure and so on, if human capital inequalities have to be reduced, and if we are to avoid the deep threats to human capital. Now, in deciding how to suggest how we could approach this, we focused on technology entry points rather than specific technologies. We do not say, for instance, let's have blockchain or let's use drones or whatever, because firstly, these technologies keep changing. Secondly, their level and scale of adoption in individual countries and different sectors depends on a large number of factors. But what we are indicating is that there are certain areas in which we must build capabilities and invest in the public sector in order to allow these technologies to benefit human capital. And this diagram explains briefly that, we identify about 9 technology entry points, as we call them, in order to promote inclusion, in order to build future resilience and adaptability, and to improve service delivery. We also say there are specific technologies that are developing, AR, VR, robotics, 3D printing, etc. But these 9 technology entry points kind of cover what is likely to come down the pike, but what will really help to build and protect human capital, deploy and utilize human capital, and empower human capital. And then we group them broadly as essential and cross-cutting, okay, and what we call customization and integration, and then what is really transformational. Now, we don't mean to imply by this that there's a sequential order that you need to follow or that everything has to be done. It really depends on what is possible, what is feasible, what is desirable, etc. But these are the areas we should get involved in, and ideally the essential and cross-cutting is something we should do, and in the transformational part, the technology and data governance. Now the remaining slides are a little dense, so we won't go into depth in each of them, just give a few examples. For instance, the first mile equitable digital access, which is essential and cross-cutting. South Asia is actually the region with the maximum number of people who are still unconnected to the internet. And therefore, if we are talking of using converging technologies that depend on connectivity, data, computing power, powered by AI, etc. If you really want this to help the poor and the vulnerable, you need to talk about having first mile digital access. By that, we mean not just broadband connectivity, which should of course be a meaningful level of broadband connectivity, but also devices, foundational digital skills, and where it's not possible for every household, you want community-based access. You want to make sure that women and underprivileged groups actually have certain levels of access. And what we can do is to help define meaningful access standards, perhaps activate the universal service funds or find other solutions. But this cannot be left as something for just the telecom ministry or agency or others to do as an afterthought. This has to be quite central to the design of HD services and central to the technology rollout. And we do advocate for this as essential, actually, for building the human capital at the first mile. Secondly, community participation and trust. As I said, usually this is not considered a technology agenda and not an agenda for HD, also human development, but it is, if you don't have that right from the beginning, you will not have espousal of technology and locally adapted solutions. We need to engage with local ecosystems. Things need to be presented in people's own languages. If we were to do this presentation, for instance, with local communities, we will not be presenting it in this manner, but in a manner that is comprehensible to them, that is actually addressing the concrete problems that they're facing. So how do we build that? We give an example of how the state of Kerala in India, how this community-based ecosystem helped them to deal with the COVID crisis. As you know, they're still holding up and able to deal with the situation in India, even while many other states are struggling. Okay. And then transformational and cross-cutting, more difficult perhaps, but really we need to lay the groundwork now, is the technology and data governance system. So developing a policy and regulatory framework, in particular, let's say, focusing on data from HD sectors to promote beneficial use while creating safeguards for data collection, privacy, storage, and use. This must be not the agenda just of the telecom people and or the data protection agency, but also of the ministries of education, health, social protection, and for all those who are engaged in HD. Over to you, Klaus.
Thank you very much, Sajitha. Turning now to customization and integration, sort of the maps that we displayed here on the left side are trying to convey sort of a sense of the rich language diversity in South Asia. And there's the question of a very important part of being disempowered digitally is of not having access to content that is relevant to you in your local language. So we are arguing that local content adaptation, whether it's in pictorial form, whether this is in terms of local narratives or local data, is very important to reach out of school children, to reach adults, stimulate new learning opportunities. And I think translation technologies could help in that regard to make this more cost effective. During COVID, there have been a number of low-tech solutions in Nepal that have been tried in both education and health. And sort of thinking beyond COVID for a minute, the question is whether sort of a hybrid model could actually continue to work, whether there is continued take-up for this. We've heard, for instance, in the health sector that there are low-cost tech solutions that have been tried. From sort of the initial impression is that there's interest in this, but the business model in terms of making this lucrative for the private sector to offer, that was sort of a shortcoming, or that was difficult. Now, turning to HD public-private platforms, looking from the outset in, probably the most interesting and transformative initiative has been the ascendancy of the National Clearinghouse, the fintech platform that enjoys fairly strong uptake from our understanding, but importantly, with government participation. And sort of this type of public-private platform that right from the beginning focuses on user needs, defines and incentivizes key stakeholders to participate in this, would really serve a lot of human development services in education, health, job platforms, and training programs, social delivery of assistance programs. Next slide, please. Now, turning to this integrated social delivery system, a registry is quite central. And given Nepal's federal structure, we also have great sympathy and support for the fact that each province has, in fact, different requirements. In fact, that is the ultimate idea behind an integrated social registry, that this is sort of a tool that can adapt to specific geographical needs. It can respond to different types of crisis situations. It can target specific groups. And Nepal has a very good data set for poverty profile. So in other words, there is sort of a very strong basis for allowing the delivery of these type of services through a functioning fintech and payment infrastructure. Now, in sort of just going back, one aspect, of course, for this whole social registry is sort of the combination of doing this both for human development, but also in terms of responding to disaster incidents. Next, please. In terms of data-driven decision mechanism, we have sort of focused on two type of technologies, if you will, or that where we see some promise and some application. One are geospatial technologies, the ability to connect spatial data with demographic data and for doing this in a way that allows for targeting based on phones, credit cards, GPS system combined with remote sensing. And the other one is sort of a combination of, even though we are not specific to technologies, we can see the potential of using sensors and drones to deliver and to overcome logistical challenges. I think there's been quite a lot of interest in terms of using drones for delivery of medicine to remote areas. Now, these type of systems really require a strong consensus around the data standards to make sure that they're actually interoperable and that the decision making tools that are driving this are really understood by the public sector as well as by users. And I think that's where some of the gaps are in terms of public sector skills for data literacy. Now, open science is maybe something that doesn't immediately come to mind when we talk about human capital development and technology, yet at the same time, it is exactly the availability of data and the exchange of data that has allowed a lot of the digital revolution in science. Sajitha mentioned this in the case of vaccine development and agriculture. We have seen, or we have heard in Nepal, the rollout of the Optima Nutrition Program, which is also using sort of a combination of behavioral as well as scientific evidence to improve nutritional programs for women and for young children in the first 1,000 days. So in other words, open science is something that would allow Nepal to participate in and take advantage of scientific discoveries and applications for the benefit of human development. Next slide, please. In terms of inclusive and open AI, this may be 3 to 5 years out, yet at the same time, there's a gradual upgrading that can already take place. I think in the case of health, there are vast opportunities to use this to improve our understanding of disease. In education, in terms of targeting, the targeting also and delivery of public services is another area. The point that we want to make is that there's a lot of potential for using this in a way of personalizing the delivery. At the same time, not doing it in such a way that it doesn't reinforce inequality, bias, and exclusion, the concentration of power, and the risk of control, particularly because so much of this depends on the ownership of data and the need for transparency of how algorithms actually are operating, the accountability and the grievance mechanism that we are still just experimenting with. Next slide, please. So summing up in terms of what do we see as the future for human capital in Nepal, the opportunity is now. The plans have been made, the strategies have been set. Now is really the question of on implementation. Digital Nepal has this unifying vision for inclusion, jobs, competitiveness. I think the sense that we have heard from the experts in Nepal is it's important to rebrand, if you will, Nepal as a country of a digital capability, and that it's not just a country of the mountains, but it's also the digital Nepal that is in its future. This capacity for digital decision-making around data really needs to permeate across all government levels and stakeholders. And I think given the federal dynamics in Nepal, this is really transformed now all the way down to provinces and mayors. And it is important to do this in a way that attaches equal importance to both resilience for natural disaster prevention and response, as well as human capital development. And this can be done through converging technologies. To repeat something that we have learned and heard much about is community engagement is a real key factor for adapting these technologies to solve local problems. Without this, it will become a digital-only solution. It will be a top-down, and it will be driven essentially from the private sector, but often at the exclusion of those who can't afford it. And given the uncertainty that we are all have gotten used to over the last year and more, having the agility to adapt to these changing circumstances is very critical. Therefore, a key part is actually to develop scenarios of the futures and to really discuss what the implications of that is. Now, there are sort of two specific examples that we felt bring a lot of that concretely to life. One is voices and choices, or what we call voices and choices. We thought sort of having a really almost live picture, maybe every 4 months, to produce a report in terms of what is the human development trend in Nepal, using locally generated data, using the different social media platforms, geospatial data, and really working with regional researchers and think tanks to produce this, disseminate it in local languages, make this available through local platforms so that people and policymakers can see live what the picture is when it comes down to human development. I think the most important part is that this must be owned and is owned by Nepal itself, and that this could help create a much more informed public discussion about data protection, data transparency, and the learning. The second idea that we feel has a lot of potential are what we called iLabs for human development. This is something that could be integrated and funded through operations funded by development partners. It could be as part of a competitive identification of solutions. These are innovation labs, and ultimately what is behind this is to create sort of a momentum towards building local ecosystems for innovation, particularly in human capital area, human development areas. That is something which we have not seen enough of, and at the same time we see that there's a lot of potential for it. We've heard good examples over the course of the last year where this has made a big difference in community empowerment and in coming up with local solutions. Thank you.
So that's it from us, Arun. Over to you.
Thank you, Sajitha. Fascinating stuff, and it's one of those it's one of those pieces of work that is just really stunning as far as I'm concerned. It helps me to understand things that I just understood in bits and pieces. It brings it all together for me, and that's just unbelievable. Thank you for that. And I think all of us pretty soon, when the report is out, will be carrying this report in our backpacks, just pulling them out and consulting it and all that. So it's really a great broad and deep and coherent piece, as I mentioned earlier. Absolutely true. You had mentioned, I mean, just to mention only, you know, this the Indian pandemic, that the backdrop under which we're doing this. And I was just listening, and then I actually explored yesterday. Tamil Nadu just has this very simple platform, health platform, that just tells people how many beds are available in real time in each of the hospitals, and beds with oxygen, beds, you know, with ventilators, and it's just updated on a real-time basis. Tremendously important piece of information for people as they make decisions on where to go. And if hospitals are already full, they don't have to go there. They can go to another hospital where there's availability. I mean, it was just fascinating. And this is one of these great examples of a state that is doing really well in the context of this bigger disaster that India is going through. Just only very briefly mentioning it. Maybe we want to move on right away to Swarnim, Dr. Swarnim Wagle, who will give the first response. And then after that, we'll move on with, you know, just put your hands up and move on. The experts first, the expert panelists. If you don't have anything specific and major to contribute at this point, that's perfectly fine. So don't feel, you know, pressured that you have to say something. But if you do have something to say, then raise your hand. And I would suggest no more than just a few minutes, because we do want to give opportunities for everybody to say something or the other if they wanted to. So Swarnim, kindly proceed.
Thank you very much. So as the chairman of IIDS, you know, it's been a distinct honor to host these very high quality presentations by world-class professionals. And in this year of COVID and Zoom, we've sat through dozens of presentations, and this one really stood out for me. So I'd like to commend Sajitha and Klaus. It was a full hour, but it was worth it, I think. So thank you so much. It was really rich and very polished. And although I felt that you need a separate framework to unify all your frameworks, there are so many to grapple with. I think the opening framework was really, really, really good, where you talked about the info and the cogno and the nano and the bio. And I'm here in Dhulikhel, so let me make a plug for Nepal as a former policymaker outside Kathmandu Valley, in this beautiful resort town just outside Kathmandu Valley. But I was thinking that, when I was a policymaker, I used to talk about, doing the world's work from atop a mountain in Nepal with a laptop, right? So this is exactly what I'm doing right now. And I can see that colleagues been connected from Washington, DC, to Professor Alok Bora from New Mexico, Dr. Homurthy Panta in Australia. I saw NPC member, Planning Commission member, Dr. Usha Jha. This is, for me right now, my vision is sort of being fulfilled, So here I am with a laptop on a mountaintop in Nepal, Dhulikhel, on a full moon day. You can probably see a full moon on my back. And we're connected globally, literally, right now as we speak. So this is truly amazing. So the internet, the ubiquitous internet that you talked about, is what is bringing us all together. Most of us have taken at least a single dose of the COVID vaccine. So hence we are not sick, or at least not as sick as we would otherwise be. So that's biotechnology. I drove my nice little electric vehicle, which is hollow, really hollow. It's connected by nanotechnology. And the cognitive technology is really, what we have with us. So this framework that you presented, it really resonates. The nano and the cogno and the info and the bio, that is really now the new normal. That's going to be a new normal going ahead. Did I press something here? Okay. So thank you so much for that. And I really liked this. The potentials. So these combination of these four converging technologies, and I understand that in the report you depart from using these notions of disruptive technologies or transformational technologies, which have almost become a cliche, and you sort of depart and say, hang on, let's talk about converging technologies and what they can do for augmenting human capabilities. Now, so the delivery of education, health, nutrition, social protection, and all that has been well acknowledged, and you presented it very well. But you also acknowledged, the divides, the flip sides, right? Do these technologies accentuate existing inequalities, power asymmetries? Do they undermine trust, social cohesion? And from the era of Trump onwards, all this automated disinformation and how that can be so damaging to mature democracies, but also fledgling democracies like ours. So I just loved, again, it's a lot of frameworks and a lot of things that you have thrown in and packed, but I think the slow unpacking of this by experts, by stakeholders, by policymakers in South Asia and elsewhere would really inform the next generation of policymaking as we come out of COVID, realizing that digitalization, this accelerated pace of adoption on digitalization, is the way to go, to do governance better, to do development better. So this is, as Arun said, I think really, really going to be very, very useful in the days ahead. Now, let me make a plug for another World Bank report, the 2016, which until this report came, was sort of my organizing framework when I thought about digital transformation. And I think this is embedded in what you've covered in this report, but I really liked the way, that earlier flagship report, the WDR 2016, also framed many of the issues, right? So on the divides, automation without skills. So that really emphasized the skills agenda, and that accentuating inequalities, that is very important. That challenge remains with us today, and possibly even in a more pronounced form. Scale without competition, the growing concentration of big tech. Again, in 2016, it was probably not as big a problem as it is now. And we had a very fascinating conversation with Kaushik Basu, who is looking at new modes of antitrust laws, because the old 20th century model of dealing with concentration was breaking them up. So Standard Oil was split into 37 units. AT&T was split into, I think, 7 units. So that was the old 20th century way of dealing with monopolistic powers and over concentration, which really screwed up consumers, right? In 21st century, with the big tech, that's not the way to go, because that defeats the whole efficiency argument and the benefits that consumers derive from concentration of big tech. You really can't have 50 Ubers and 200 Amazons in the 21st century. So what's the way to go about it? You need new antitrust laws. And this is all about distributed shareholding and the different models of ownership that we need to deal with. So this is not directly related to your thing, but this touches very much at the heart of the digital agenda we're talking about. And the third one is, of course, information without accountability. This is about control and all that. Now, on the dividend side, while we're talking about these cutting-edge technologies, and this was powerfully made in that report 2016 WDR, that you still need these old-fashioned traditional analog complements, right? And this is where I would now like to move to Nepal. On regulations, how are we doing? Have we removed all the barriers to tech adoption? It's an unfinished agenda. Some would argue this agenda has barely begun, right? On institutions, on accountability, e-governance, facilitating citizen engagement, and ensuring competition and all that, we are way behind. And this is where elite capture, policy capture, this crony capitalistic modes of functioning, comes into play. And I have major complaints about our service providers right here. And there's a big political economy reform agenda awaiting to be taken up. And finally, though, and this speaks directly to the human capital agenda, the skills, right? So how do we build foundational IT skills? How do we think about careers and not jobs? How do we instill this whole notion of lifelong learning? And all that remains very important. And the challenge of revamping these entrenched education systems is a generational project. It takes 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So can we short circuit it in the era of tech and digital by going for this modular, very fast delivery sort of skills tsunami kind of a campaign and an agenda? And that's very much because the patience is short and thin, and you really can't wait for the public education system, which in Nepal's is schools, more than 75% of our kids, for that to be transformed to be ready for the tech agenda, which is really changing in very, very fast. So I think the framework really is insightful and gives us a lot of policy food for thought to really take forward. Let me close by saying that in Nepal, we've done leapfrogging quite well. So I've repeated this many times. 1991, we started with 71,000 landlines, land phones. Now we have 30 million cell phones, over 30 million cell phone subscriptions. That leapfrogging happened within a span of 5 to 10 years. And that really enables us. So in terms of capacities and the infrastructural wherewithal, we do have that. Landlockedness pushes us to go for digital adoption in a big way, because we can show, because of our structural handicaps, that this is actually justifiable even on cost grounds, even on efficiency grounds. And the diaspora and the demography, the young demography that is on our side, and the diaspora, right? 1/3 of the country is outside, and they are well aware of what's going on. They're familiar. They may not be supremely educated, but they know, they're familiar with these technologies. They've seen the potentials in countries, not just in the West, but even in the Middle East and Malaysia and Korea. And that ready adoption, that potential is there. On the flip side, I think in the digital agenda, I liked how Sajitha sort of flipped the last mile to the first mile. But the discussion on first mile, the middle mile, the last mile, and then the invisible mile, right? So I think in Nepal, the invisible mile, there's a lot to be done there. and how, and that invisible mile is often about greater risk taking, undertaking specialized expertise and all that. The other miles are sort of well known, we just have to do it, but the invisible mile is really has to be contextualized and adapted to our home circumstances. And finally, the analog complements as it relates to Nepal, which I've already spoken, the political economic implications, and the skills tsunami that we really have to unleash in this country if we are to even catch up and match the technological leapfrogging with the human capital leapfrogging. So let me stop there. We have great experts and participants and panelists. So let me welcome you all again to this very rich session. The time wise, we will spill over perhaps, but I really feel that it will be worth it. And thank you again for having the Iids be the platform to host it. Thanks to Arun for putting it all together, and my colleagues at Iids, Biswas Gauchan, Binisha Nepal, and everyone else. So I'll be muting myself and closing my video, but I'll be listening to you all. Thank you so much, and greetings from Dulik Hill.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wagle. I want to get started with the right away. I think Mr. Anand Khanalji, kindly proceed with your question or comment. And again, as I mentioned, let's keep it brief to the point. I think the idea is for Sajitha and Klaus to, in this particular instance, to not necessarily answer all these questions, right, Sajitha? I think it's more of a listening side more. And at some point you will give some brief remarks, but not necessarily answer each and every one of these questions. It's more important for us to listen to the experts in terms of where what they want to convey. So kindly proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sajitha and Klaus, for a wonderful presentation. Even for people who update on technologies very constantly, the presentation, the kind of converging technologies that you have packed and its implication for human development cannot be understood by all. And even if it seems like we have understood, the comprehension becomes very weak. If you present the same thing to the government officials and the politicians, I think their head will blow. So that's the initial point. First point, that there's some data, the Nepal's progress on connectivity access particularly has been misrepresented in your presentation. That is, the latest report says that the fixed telephone density in Nepal is lacking, which is just 2.69% against 11.9% of the global average. And mobile telephone, a global average of 105%, whereas Nepal's teledensity is 128.25%. And the fixed broadband, Nepal has significantly outpaced the global average, which is 15.2%, and Nepal's is 22.62%. In terms of active mobile broadband, Nepal is 61.47% against global average of 75%. So, but on the average, Nepal's progress on connectivity, despite the challenges, is commendable. Third point that I would like to echo the analog complements that Dr. Shonim was talking about based on the WDR 2016 report of the World Bank. The analog complements are really missing still, and probably it will continue to be missing in the future also, because there is no holistic and whole of the government approach in really promoting the ICT or any technology related projects or policy making. I think this presentation, based on this presentation, I think the World Bank needs a lot of homework to inject this idea into the stakeholders that we consider in Nepal, the government, the private sector, academia. I think World Bank has a huge role ahead. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Ms. Sumana ji, Sumana Shrestha ji, please proceed.
Yes, hi, thank you
I
very
have
much.
the list of all of you with your hands raised here in order, so kindly proceed.
Sure, thank you very much, Dr. Arun. Klaus and Sita, thank you so much for your presentation. I really look forward to reading the in-depth report. However, as I was listening to the presentation, I wonder if a critical aspect, which I would probably call an enabling factor for any of this to happen, which I believe is like a management and leadership, is missing from the framework. Because without that, it's, I'll give you two examples of that. And I'll also probably cite one of the economics paper that came around in 2011 that basically questions, does management matter? Evidence from India. And it cites three things. First, they did this field experiment where they provided free consulting on modern management practices to textile companies, and it raised average productivity by 11% through improved quality, efficiency, reduced inventory. I'm just reading off the abstract right now. Second, it increased decentralization of decision-making as better information flew. And it enabled owners to delegate decisions to mid-level managers. And finally, and thirdly, it increased the use of computers necessitated by the data collection and analysis involved in modern management, right? So from my personal experience as well, running and advising companies in Nepal, it seems like that is probably the key missing aspect when we think of human development and what is going to take for Nepal to leapfrog. Because if you I'll give you a few examples. One personal, which is most of the time when people reach out for consulting support or building their team, it's rarely technical talent. Technical talent is actually possible to find. It's the same coding language, whether you are coding machine learning from Ukraine or America, Australia, or Nepal. That translates quite easily across borders. But what is really difficult to translate is the management and the cultural connotation and engagement that's required. I think part of it was reflected in Dr. Wagli's latter comment as well, what is unique to Nepal or unique to each culture or unique to each working environment. The second example is just today, I had a meeting with a lot of technical people and we were all trying to brainstorm. So how can we come together to support the community, the city or district or larger country during COVID times? And it was not necessarily the absence of technical, it was not necessarily the absence of technology, or it was more the lack, or what's missing right now is coming together with clear management steps, with clear vision of this is the risk taking. Furthermore, I had run a survey 2 years back with some of the private firms, not-for-profits as well, in terms of what are skills they're looking for in their people they're looking to hire. And one thing that stood out, it was not technical skill, it was not knowledge about AI or anything, it was mostly critical thinking skill, ability to communicate, convince, and influence their counterparts. So I feel like without this critical ingredient, it's difficult to imagine a country being able to leapfrog just because there is technology available, right? I think we need to separate technical literacy from data literacy, and data literacy comes a lot from having a management that puts faith in the data and also who can organize the people, the technology and the resources available to make it happen. So again, thank you so much for, it was really interesting and I really look forward to reading the full report, but I feel like this part is something you probably want to look into as well, because I feel the way to tackle and address this management gap, mid-level management gap in Nepal is going to be very different than technology transfers that we can do, which it already exists. So thank you. That's all, Dr. Arun, from my side.
Thank you, Sumanajit. A very critical point you raised. Moving on to Sajitha Bhatta.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for the presentation, even though I don't feel I'm qualified enough to give any feedbacks or comments on the given presentation. But you know, I basically want to highlight few of the things in terms of how the future could unfold. And if you look at the way we consume data right now, when we move to AI and machine learnings and things like that, right now the interactions of data we have is between human and the machine. So, you know, most people are taking selfies, uploading it on their Instagrams or TikTok videos and so on and so forth, right? And even right now, when the consumption of data is very low in terms of how we upload or download the data from the cloud or internet, we still have a huge disparity in the infrastructural connectivity. So the Nepal government still defines 512 kbps as a broadband data, and because of which I think people living in rural areas would not have enough connectivity to have Zoom sessions with their teachers, and therefore students who live in Kathmandu, like our children, would outwit them because they have the access to technology, and therefore they can learn from remote classrooms, which people in rural villages can't. So the disparity is already there. And compounded by, you know, tomorrow when we speak about AI, and I'd just like to zero in on, say, agriculture. So when say, for example, a precision agriculture would happen, for example, we already have a huge amount of imaging technologies and high resolution cameras. So just imagine we have drone footage taking the shots of all the crops, and along with the temperature and the moisture and real-time data, and uploading on cloud, happening on real time, by which the predictive algorithms can now predict what kind of diseases these crops are likely to have. And then we could already, in due course of time, use pesticides to reduce the waste and therefore increase the productivity. Now, when that happens, the amount of data that would be consumed by a farm would be thousands of times larger than what we consume right now. However, if you look at where our farms are placed, where our poultry farms are placed, they're placed in remote areas, which does not have human density. So it's very likely that these places tomorrow, when we speak about production and precision farming and agriculture on use of technology, these places are very likely to consume high amount of data. But if you look at the way the telecom services as the basic infrastructure for this human capital growth is going to unfold in future, it's very less likely that we would see a 5G tower being placed in any of these rural farms, because it does not make economic sense. So if you were to compare ourselves with the Western societies, you know, just like the industrial revolution that increased the disparity between the rich and the poor, even in the AI revolution or the fourth industrial revolution, and with the use of 5G and the later technologies, it's very likely that it is not going to make economic sense for the use of this high amount of data for productivity purposes, because the telecom operators or the internet service providers would still like to have high-speed data at places where people can upload TikTok videos, right? As to what would make more economic sense for a telecom infrastructure provider or internet infrastructure providers to reach to those areas, specifically when we're speaking about convergent technology, and very likely these convergent technologies would be used in increasing human productivity through agriculture, through autonomous vehicles and things like that. So I think these areas, if we could find a solution to how we could make economic sense of these broadened, futuristic technologies riding on the telecom infrastructure would be very handful, I assume. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sajitha. Important points. Although I think there are these large initiatives by Google and others putting up the balloons and trying to reduce these gaps, that we're talking about, some of these basic fundamental gaps and all that. But anyways, I'm not an expert in that area. Dr. Pratibha Pandey, kindly proceed. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joshi. Thank you very much for such a comprehensive presentation. I have been involved in previous consultations as well, and I have to say that I was really happy to see this time nano and bio mentioned. Last, I think a few times we never talked about, or we didn't talk much about nano or bio, and I, representing that field, it was really pleasant to see that. I'm also with an assumption that there are details embedded in this framework. I'm not going to go into details of things, but I will go into some of the entry points and also maybe talk about a bit about the framework in terms of what could be added to the framework, or maybe emphasized in the framework. So I'll start with, we talked a lot about emerging technologies and things like that, but I feel like some of the things missing and also mentioned before was talking more about having fundamentals in place. For example, talking about innovation infrastructure and what that should look like. We talked about doing research, but without having good governance and innovation infrastructure, from policies to actually physical infrastructures, it would be really hard to do that. Another is, Sumana mentioned it, that, maybe one of the ways to sort of affect or train our human capital is having 21st century skills in them. I see how I was rewired after I left the country, went to the US to study in a liberal arts school, and that rewiring is possible. And I think we need to think more about that. How do we instill those kind of 21st century skills while we're trying to tackle this multi-generational problem of trying to reform the education system in Nepal. So having said some of these things, I'll go into some of the entry points from maybe the nanobio side of things. I think one of the things that we could really talk about is technology transfer. Facilitating technology transfer can really expedite a lot of things in Nepal, not just in IT sector or data sectors, but also in, for example, biopharma, being able to generate, example, our own insulin. There are a lot of companies or organizations, not-for-profit organizations, that are willing to transfer technology to developing countries or developing economies, and we haven't been able to exploit that. And one of the example is not having fundamental in place. For example, we're really afraid of the words like GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and things like that. So I think the governance side of things and having flexibility in terms of policies for emerging technology is some of the things we can tune government into to be able to facilitate technology transfer. Another is Sikshit talked about this, have agriculture and including Internet of Things in agriculture. Some of the things he already talked about, maybe going even more specific. Our competitive advantage is having this diverse flora and fauna spread across different elevations. And if we can really put Internet of Things in it, not just in terms of agricultural productivity, but also having competitive advantage in terms of having really exclusive medicinal plants, or let's say flora and fauna, in terms of conservation as well as value addition. Another is also plant variety protection. Some things we didn't really talk about, and I'm sure like you might be thinking about is, and government is really interested in this, whichever ministry we go, especially if we go to industry, commerce, supply, Ministry of Science and Technology, is indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. How do we institutionalize indigenous and traditional knowledge that are in Nepal using modern technologies? And also databases, having databases or digital libraries also goes in here. So those could be some of the low hanging fruits that we can, sort of could be a smaller wins. And we talked a lot about technology. We didn't really talk, and I'm sure it will come later on, but intellectual property. Today is World Intellectual Property Day. And when we talk about technology and bringing any kind of technology or information, if we don't embed intellectual property protection from the beginning, it'll be really hard for us to go into international market or even survive in the national market. So I think that's something we can put in the framework itself. And I really like the idea of inclusive innovation, where we have put this word itself in the Science and Technology Policy Implementation Plan. So when we say inclusive innovation, maybe we can be more explicit in terms of mentioning contextual innovation, community-based innovation, involving communities not just in designing the innovation, but also coming up with innovative solutions for their own community that not only gives a solution to their problems, but also gives a sense of agency in the community and really activates local government also. We work very closely with local government, some of the organizations we're involved with, and the mayors, deputy mayors, the municipalities, they have resources as well as willpower, much more than what we saw before in the centralized system. So it's almost like a competition. And I think this is a great way to enter such places by using inclusive innovation, and also having or promoting innovation that is affordable, accessible, available, and acceptable. So I think we already talked about this, so the trust also comes in here. And we talked about ethics in terms of data. I really agree with this. In terms of data from IT standpoint, but also health standpoint, and how we share information and data from the research point of view also. So I think these were just some of the points that I had in mind, and thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Pratibhaji. Thank you so much. Moving on, I'm already sensing, and I hope Sajitha and Klaus, if we run over, as Swarnim also hinted, it shouldn't matter too much for you if we run over a few minutes or half an hour or so, because this is such a great group of great people that it will be very difficult to get all of them together like this. So I would really appreciate if we can spill over, if it does spill over, to go on for a few minutes longer. For those who can stay on, right? I mean, if you have to leave, you will leave. I will move on to Dr. Arniko Pandey.
Yes, good evening, good morning. Thank you so much for really interesting.
Arniko, your voice, your connection is not good. There is something going on.
Can you hear me if I turn the video off?
No, not good at all. It's very garbled, kind of. Okay, maybe we move on. Let's move on with Ms. Sherpa. You can proceed now, and then I'll ask Arniko to join next.
Yeah, thank you so much. Am I clear?
Yeah. You're fine.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the very enlightening presentation and for including all the important elements for digital transformation. For instance, like access, skills, regulation, and inclusion. That was very important. So from an epidemiological perspective, I'd say that the Digital Health Initiative came out very strongly, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic, to reduce the spread of misinformation, where World Health Organization also reached out to Google to modify algorithms to present only authoritative information on search engines. And then there was big data and AI, which supported to forecast and predict the locations of epidemic for pandemic preparedness. And there were automated digital contact tracing apps, which were developed, for instance, like those that came up from Apple and Google with exposure notification system. These are very important advances in health, especially in epidemiology, but there are some of the concerns that I would like to address. One of the concerns on automated missions of healthcare is, yes, there will be more efficiency. For example, the contact tracing app may be able to anonymously notify that people may have been exposed to a certain case of contagion, but an app cannot do what human beings can. For instance, they don't have localized information of the context, what may have led to the infection, exposure, human compassion, empathy, and assurance. Nepal has a mixed healthcare system with both public and private sector, and our healthcare system already lacks compassion. It's very mechanical. So we need to think how we are going to deal with such issues when we have so much mental health cases, and also the suicide rates are going high. So this is one of the first concerns. The second one is in countries like ours, where the governance system is not very strong. It's not enough just to have laws on paper. Implementation is important, and which is very questionable at certain times. So I would propose that perhaps it's very important to have a joint international strategy to regulate and evaluate the use of digital technology in health to improve the digital governance system. That's number two. Number three is partnerships between technology and public health authorities have disrupted the established ideas between who is in charge of what. So that needs to be discerned right from the beginning. And number four, there has been there is a study that was released last year, which is the Affordability Report 2020, where it is where it's written that poor people have for poor people, the smartphone costs more than 25% of their average monthly income. And the cost of bandwidth for 1 gigabyte is 5% of their average monthly income. We have 2.5 billion people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, including from Nepal, who needs care and who are the most neglected. So how are we going to support these people? We need to put these people in the center whenever we are talking about digital transformation for the development of human capital. So that's the final point. And there is a Lancet and Financial Times commission study, which is coming up probably in a couple of months to explore the convergence of digital health and AI to support in achieving universal health coverage 2030, which will also be very important in informing how to move forward with digital health. So thank you.
Very pertinent points. Thank you so much. And now we will try Arnico again.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Much better.
Okay, I had to kick 3 family members off of YouTube in order to be able to have a stable connection.
Great.
So thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. I learned a lot, but it also meant that the contents of the presentation is very different from what I had expected from the title. And that kind of has to come, and if I look at it from the climate change hat that I'm wearing at the moment for this, I look very much at all the disruptions caused by COVID as a small sampling, a small appetizer of what we're expecting to see from climate change in the coming decades. In Nepal, even if global average temperatures are stabilized at 1.5 degrees, we're in a mountain area where temperatures rising much faster. We're expecting a 1.5 degree global average temperature stabilize, which is best case scenario at the moment, would still be 1.8 to 2.2 degrees warming in the high mountain areas, the loss of a third or more of our glaciers, a lot more heat waves, a lot more floods, landslides, also a lot more droughts, a lot more of the types of forest fires that have been creating horrible air quality this year. So really the COVID disruptions are just a very small appetizer. From that perspective, human development, human capital, the work we do in human capital also needs to prepare us for what's coming up. So I see certain things echoed in your framework. We need a lot more monitoring, a lot more data generation, a lot more data interpretation. That needs AI, it needs nanotechnology, it needs people capable of deploying and understanding the data, monitoring the changes happening in the landscape, doing models, doing forecasting, creating warning systems, knowing in advance what's happening in the next couple of hours that might kill you, or what's happening in the next weeks or next months that might affect our crops, etc. That needs a massive investment in science and technology and R&D, in people capable of doing the necessary work to keep us as safe as we possibly can, adapting to the changing climate. But we need a lot more than that. I was kind of surprised not to find in the report, and that is improvements in human capital beyond technology. And Sumana hinted a little bit at it. I think there's a strong need to improve social science and to improve the understanding of issues of vulnerability, of inequality, of inclusion, of differential impacts of climate change on different people. And it needs, you mentioned the data-driven decision-making mechanism, but also more broadly, it needs better leadership than we have now. It needs leaders who are more self-aware, more logical in their thinking, more able to make evidence-based decisions, more moral, better understanding of the global situation. It was very embarrassing actually to read that our leaders reached out to India now asking for oxygen. Come on, there's other ways of preparing for the COVID wave that's happening in Nepal that will like hit us over the head in the next 2 weeks than asking India at this point. But it needs people who are able to, leaders who can represent the country on the world stage, who can negotiate, who understand the negotiation partners, people who understand technology. It's not just about having a technical workforce able to use new technology, but also leaders who understand new technology. It needs more critical thinking. The solution to our energy storage problem, where much of the rainwater falls in the monsoon, but we have hydropower shortages in the dry season, might not be a 19th century solution of building a high dam. There might be other more distributed ways of generating the electricity that we need and storing it, for maybe solar power overnight or something like. It needs leadership that is able to be a lot more capable of thinking broadly, thinking globally, and understanding Nepal's context and guiding the country forward. And without having that, just having the technology and the tools alone, I don't think will lead us where we want us to go, especially given the challenges from climate change that are coming. And if the way COVID has been handled in Nepal is any indication, there's a lot of room for improvement. I'll leave my comments at this, but I'll be happy to join in or to engage in a discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Absolutely, I think this is a kind of a chicken and egg problem in a sense that, on the one hand, technology, if done right, and with all of the aspects that Sajitha and Klaus mentioned, and if it's structured well, could help to reduce those gaps and could help to reach audiences that are not currently in the system, and could help to lift a lot of those who are disadvantaged currently faster out of those conditions. On the other hand, you do see this, right now you do need people who can actually be able to deliver some of these technologies and handle it well and have the values and morals and so on and so forth. I couldn't agree more with Arniko with respect to liberal arts and social sciences and all that as well. So anyways, moving on to Ms. Thapa, and then we'll move on to Dr. Pun after that. Thanks.
Great presentation. I learned a lot. And I will be wearing a hat of women in tech and from a private sector and catering to the international market as I'm talking about it. So I see a concern of the pipeline, in qualified pipeline from Sumanaji and, Dr. Arniko that mentioned about the pipeline that is qualified, the pipeline that comes into the tech sector, the pipeline that the qualified technique, the students that come into the sector contributing in the next generation that has that kind of skill set, right? So what I'm talking about is more of a soft skills. That includes critical analytics, analytical skills, and including that, the tech skills, the foundations. So if we have at least at a minimum of that, as tech resources, we can cater those qualified candidates to the right direction in the tech sector. So as the tech sector is booming in different technology, AI, IoT, we can divert these qualified candidates to the right direction. But right now, what's missing in the pipeline is these soft skills that we have to tackle it beyond the technical challenges that we're facing around the world. And which is not just for Nepal, but with Southeast Asia, we are all facing the same problem as such in the soft skills sector, right? So as Nepal, we can learn from this sooner and, work on it, as Dr. Arniko mentioned that, and Sumanaji mentioned that, we can be ahead, not just overall, but even in Southeast Asia, along with our technical skills, along with our soft skills, we can do this along with the community engagement, academia, industry, everybody focusing on the tech, which we're trying to do as, from different sectors, but promoting with the landlockedness, promoting Nepal into the international market, which we are trying to break every day. Putting Nepal just in the digital map itself is tough right now, right? We have to convince our clients that Nepal can be catered as a technology into the technology map. And, these are the things that the policymakers and country, leaders can work on to put at least Nepal in the digital market so that we as a private sector, when we go into this sector, we don't have to build, the basics of Nepal into the digital market, right? So, and along with that, again, increasing the digital capacity as such in Nepal, which we're trying, taking one step at a time, one country at a time, and building those kind of, digital capacity is so important. And in the report, I think we're tracking the human capacity, and I'm sure this would be great for private sector to say that, at least our pipeline is increasing to the level of deliberation that we're trying to do internationally. So I think I'll make it short here. Thank you so much for the opportunity today.
Thank you so much. And now to Dr. Mahavir Pun, kindly, sir, proceed. And what I'll do is, I think at that point, we're just going to get a quick feedback from Sajitha and Klaus before we open it up a little bit more. And we do have other colleagues, Dr. Alok Bora and others who have some comments as well subsequent to that. So Dr. Pun, please proceed.
Thank you very much. I'm not an expert. I'm just a worker. So I don't have much to add on the presentation, great presentation that you showed us. As I am used to do things that normally people don't do it, and also I'm used to talking about this, topics that normally people don't talk about. So just to add something on the title of the program you have today, like human capital, accelerating in Nepal. That was the title of the today's program, and I would like to add something like this because I work on it. So let me add something like this: creative and innovative human capital nurturing in Nepal. That is something I want to have here in Nepal because we have been doing. I mean, there have been a lot of things happening. To nurture the human capital, to train the human capital of Nepal, and accelerating them for the development of Nepal. But there has not been much being done here for nurturing. I mean, it's not even accelerating. There has not been being done much for nurturing the creative and innovative human capitals of Nepal. And once we nurture them, then we can accelerate, them to, to do more. So that's what I want to share. I'm sharing it is because, just let me give an example. So all of you know how to drive a car. So when you drive a car, first what you do is you start the car first and put the clutch and gear in the car. Then you press on the accelerator and slowly the car accelerates. There's something is needed to accelerate the human capital, especially I'm talking about the most creative and innovative human capital. The to nurture those creative and innovative human capital, very little has been done in Nepal, and there is no chance to accelerate those innovative and talented human capital. So we have to nurture them first, and then once we nurture them, and once we create the culture of research and innovation in Nepal, then we can accelerate the them. I mean, this creative and innovative human capital in Nepal, and for then once they are accelerated, then they can work on developing all kind of technology, not only converging technology, but all kind of technology that is needed for the economic development of Nepal. So that's the comment I want to add. And especially when talking about Southeast Asia, the region is not only about Nepal, like the most of the countries in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world. Let me give you an example why this has not been happening. For example, the percentage of the GDP some of these countries are spending for research and development. Is you can have a look. It's the World Bank data. I got it from the internet. And for example, India is spending 1.2%. Thailand is spending 1%. Pakistan is spending 0.3%, and Nepal is spending about 0.3%. And as long as this, very little percentage of the GDP is spent for research and development and for nurturing the innovative people, and there is nothing can be done to accelerate the most innovative and talented human capital. And unless and until we do that, we cannot make these third world countries or the least developed countries to to developed countries. So that is something I have been working on, and we have established an innovation center from the grassroots level, and we're trying our best to nurture the most innovative and talented young people of Nepal, and trying to help them to become entrepreneur. Because until and unless we produce as many entrepreneurs as possible for the economic development of Nepal, I mean, there is no chance to make a poor country like Nepal a developed country. So that's the comment I want to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Poon. Okay, I think we want Sajitha and Klaus, who've been taking a lot of notes and listening to all the comments, to maybe give some quick feedback at this point, not very extensive, but just quickly to respond. I think that'll give some space for you to say a few things in terms of what you've been hearing. And then subsequent to that, we'll just open the floor to a larger audience, and then we'll continue for another 20 minutes or so, maybe maximum 20 minutes or so, after which we will make some closing remarks, as we said. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Arun. And I really want to thank Swarnim, and I mean, I won't go through all the names, but it's an incredibly rich set of comments. And I mean, I can't tell you how much, I think I speak for Klaus also, how much we appreciate this level of engagement. And obviously, I'm not going to try and answer everything, but let me group it as 5 points, and then I'll take 2 or 3 of them, and maybe Klaus can deal with especially the part on innovation. I sort of group them as, one is about the frameworks and the framework of frameworks. I liked Swarnim's idea. The second is about the analog counterpart, the third is about broadly a lot of questions and comments about public sector capabilities. Fourth, I think I pick on some things related to data. And the fifth is about the innovation tech ecosystem, about the pipeline for that, about how to encourage that, and so on. And that also, a lot of things are related to education. And maybe I'll ask Klaus to deal with the last one, especially the innovation tech ecosystem. He's worked a lot on that. So on the framework for frameworks and the overall frameworks, I think I would just say that when we started this work on human capital, we found that there was actually no framework even within the bank to link human capital and technology. And you're right, there's the WDR 2016, which looks at the digital revolution. There's the WDR 2021. If people haven't seen that, you should please look at that. That's Data for Better Lives. That has also a framework. The Human Capital Index of the World Bank focuses really just on the early years up to age 18 or so, and doesn't really think of the broader life cycle of human capital. So we were forced to think about 2 things. What is this technology revolution? And I think the main point there is it's underpinned by the digital revolution, but it's not only the digital technology revolution. And the second is thinking more broadly about human capital. So we think that those 2 framing things are very important. And then our technology entry points, we really wanted to avoid giving ideas about specific technologies, which was kind of the approach that some of our individual sectors, education, health, and so on, were taking. But we wanted to talk about the broader kind of implications in which of technology and human capital, where you could engage. I think the analog parts is essential. We don't go into that too much because we are focusing on the technology entry points, so to speak. Of course, regulations, the invisible mile, all those things are important, but I would say even beyond that, actually nuts and bolts, nuts and bolt physical stuff, right? Arun mentioned Tamil Nadu's digital platform for identifying where there are beds. But first you have to have beds. You have to have oxygen, you have to have doctors and so on. You know, you can't just build something up in the air. But when you have that, and along with having that, using these digital tools to help with the matching, to help with information flows, with efficiency, with targeting and so on, these are incredibly powerful. And as you build out now the infrastructure, you should build in the technological capabilities. So I think that would be what we would say is really important, to think of these two things together. I think many people mentioned quite rightly the question of public sector capabilities. Perhaps we didn't highlight it enough, but actually it's there in several of our entry points, the HD public-private platforms. We say that public sector leadership is essential to build this, in the question of data-driven decision-making, on the technology and data governance, to give you just three of the entry points which really emphasize this. Now, even this is something which I think the bank is not engaging in fully, and needs to engage in as part of accelerating human capital. And leadership and skills in the public sector is not one uniform thing. In my work on digital skills, in fact, we distinguish between what you might call specialists, where you need really the kind of people who understand, you know, what are these technologies. And then there are different levels of, you know, technical people. You need some basic data literacy and so on. And there's a whole spectrum of competencies, even in the public sector, that needs to be consciously built and should be part of our agenda, right? And that is not being done very, very holistically, I would say, even by our HD teams in the bank. And so this public sector capabilities also can be enhanced by mechanisms such as technology foresight exercises, scenario building exercises, by which you could actually expose people to what is going on. So it's not just training and things like that, but we need to think of different modalities of doing that. Finally, the point I'll take up on data, I mean, listening to colleagues like Arniko, and I think somebody else also mentioned it, Sikshit, I think mentioned it. I mean, if, for instance, on the issue of, you know, agriculture, is it sufficient now to think of just irrigation and electricity and seeds and so on as inputs? Or do you think of data also as an input? And if data is an input, then how do you, you know, create the infrastructure for data to be used by farmers, okay, to both generate and use, to be used by farmers, okay? And on the issue of climate change, I mean, we didn't perhaps emphasize it enough, you know, I would say maybe in terms of number of words, but definitely we are saying in our presentations, if there are two things that are important for the for the post-COVID recovery, it is human capital and climate resilience to climate change. And these two things have to go together, and you need local solutions, flexibility, adaptability, and so on. And that's why you need a different kind of innovation system also. So I'll hand over to Klaus there.
Thanks very much, Sajitha. Fantastic comments. I mean, it's really just like when we had our first conversation, it's embarrassing how little we know and how much you can actually contribute. So I think, again, we are learning more from you than probably the other way around. I think as far as data is concerned, what Sajitha just mentioned is really critical. When I started on this whole technology journey a couple of years ago, it is only now that I'm really starting to appreciate how much more important it is to build a data culture. And I think this data culture really needs to have local roots. Without this, I don't see us really making big headways. Now, in terms of the innovation ecosystem, I am actually quite familiar with this 2011 study that Sumana mentioned in India. Of course, one of the challenges is that the availability of consultants themselves that improve management is not enough. You need more than that, because otherwise we kept asking ourselves, why is it that based on this study alone, there has not been more take-up by companies to actually enlist the help of consultants if there was such a fantastic and very rapid return on investment by improving systems and decision-making process. So it actually goes back to the building of human capability. I think you're making, everyone throughout is making an absolutely important point that social skills, the soft skills, the creativity are indispensable. And I heard a lot of that in Nepal. I'm absolutely aware of some of the examples in terms of whether it's in finance, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in tourism. There's a lot of potential. In fact, I looked yesterday again at this whole digital roadmap for Nepal. There are 80 different initiatives in there. Now, this is almost too much. And what I didn't see is sort of a real full sort of scaling of how will this actually take place across the country that is highly fragmented, highly federalized, highly subject to different local adaptation needs. I think what we were trying to say on innovation ecosystem here is it is really important that local adaptations are embraced and are fostered, that there is a mapping of what is actually available. I think I've seen some studies that sort of says, yes, there are some local rural IT hubs, but they are numbered in the low digits. It's like 5, 6, 10 maybe. So the question is, how do we actually help connect and spur them? How do we support them? And how do we integrate those different pilots? Because and just to give you one example, last week we had one conversation in terms of what's happening in rural health in Nepal. There's a lot that has happened as a result of COVID-19. The problem is, how do we actually integrate these different background infrastructures? How do we integrate the digital health system? And how do we also incorporate some of this data protection into this so that decision makers actually are understanding that innovation systems really can only work to the extent that local decision makers then take also ownership of what is being created. I think this example of mayors having a full set of data, but not really being able to make decisions based on that, I think sort of gives you a sense this really needs to be arriving at the point of decision makers. And I think that's what that's why it is so important to have actually local authorities participated in these innovation ecosystems. I think they should also be supported through bank operations. I think particularly in the HD sectors, we have not seen enough of this. From my point, I used to work in business development, and that is something entrepreneurship is a natural as far as innovation ecosystem is concerned. I think we haven't seen enough of the HD sector also embracing this.
I can just make one more point, Arun. I think the issue that Arnika raised and others have raised about building up the science and technology capabilities, domestic ones, and you need massive investment in that. And this is true, but we urge also, you to consider whether new approaches to building up that, especially the highly specialized kind of human capital could be looked at. And this is where we put things like open science, that you could actually build up, the kind of data scientists you need or climate scientists you need and so on through these more open networks, which allow you to build capability. That doesn't mean you don't have to build the digital infrastructure for that, or you need certain protocols and data sharing protocols and many other things. But there are ways of now building up advanced human capital, which leverages the digital revolution. So just a point there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Sajitha and Klaus. I just had a question that I wanted to throw onto the table in one sentence, which is girls, women's interest in STEM from the early years, there's a huge gap. How do we address that? We talked about this pipeline of students who are needed to take this on, and it's, of course, again, it's a kind of a chicken and egg issue. Obviously, these technologies help. On the other hand, we also need the other aspect to be addressed. Anyways, anybody who can answer or has views on women in science and encouraging girls to become excited about STEM and move in these areas, we would appreciate any kind of feedback, both whether Sajitha, Klaus, or anyone else. I want to move on generally now to the open session. I know that Dr. Bishal Dakal is part of the panel. I'll give him the first opportunity. And then I think it was also Professor Tilima Yami who wanted to say something, if she's still here. Yes, you still are there. So Dr. Bishal Dakal and Professor Yami first, and then we move on to Dr. Alok Bora, and also Mr. Ramacharya had his hand up. He still does. And then if we have time, a few others, and then we can move on, and then try to close soon after that. Yeah, proceed, Dr. Vishal.
Thanks, Arun. It took time for me to really digest all the conversations going on. Good to see you, Klaus and Sajitha. I was glad to be part of the first part of conversation. Glad to see the legends like Mahavir Daishwar and the leaders now coming. My understanding actually synthesized a very small note that I think is a cardinal philosophy that I always look into. There's going to be two human. When we look in the future, I think there will be one who will create, control, and build technologies which will control the human processes. And there are the others one who will be users of these technologies. So that divide is going to be the phenomenal philosophy that is going to be rather I would be likely, I'm 40, so I'm looking at my kids' generation will be, either they will be builders or they will be users. So in that case, I think the generation now has to look into deeper how we are going to bridge the gap, be it from innovation, be it from industry prospect, be it from education, be it from commercialization. Whatever format of efforts are going to be there has to be focused on bridging that divide where the users remains the users and builders remains the builders and bigger. On that note, that I think over these lectures, probably that effort that people have put, I think I've synthesized this, and I think my efforts for way forward would be also on that direction. Thank you. It was amazing learning.
Thank you, Dr. Vishal Dakal. We now move on to Professor Yami, kindly.
Yeah. Okay, regarding the girls, encouraging girls from the rural end, I come from IIT Kanpur. IIT Kanpur has got one alumni group, especially from the girls' hostel. They are doing very well, so I'm connected with them. Also I head a women's group called WARN. This is a research group. There we are working on promoting all these interns, especially the girls from girls who are doing bachelor in mass media and sociology, bringing, give them extra courses on science side and technology side, which is very important. And we are focusing on girls who have come here in Kathmandu from rural end. From rural side, they have come here, and the understanding the parents have is, go for social studies and then get married and all those things. So I'm counseling them and telling them a story, a lot of stories. For example, from my family, we were 6 girls, 6 daughters, and I entered IIT in 1970. So the scenario was very much like India, in India as well as here. And when I cited our family stories, there were girls from girls hostel from Bangalore, who had studied in IIT Kanpur. They also related similar story. Some girls came from very rural area of India. So we are telling stories. She's writing a lot of poems. So we are ganging up. I think that works. And what I have created is a website of my own, blog site, where I am writing a lot of articles, and Facebook page, and LinkedIn. I have a lot of friends there, and also on top of that, the best part I'm enjoying is in late 1980s and early 1991, there were a lot of massive headhunting in India for IT sector, brains from IT sector, and a lot of my friends from IIT Kanpur went to California, USA, for further studies, for work and all that. So why I'm telling this is, at Pulsop Engineering Campus, where I taught for 35 years, in late 1980s, I encouraged all those students who were going abroad to get into IT field. And so the early 90s and late 80s, all those boys who graduated from the Trivandrum University under engineering faculty, they are into IT field, and they are human capital, and large number of them come from rural end. And they are the resources, the government failed to see all these resources. So I'm pressurizing the university to create a profile of those people who are settled abroad, and virtually they want to contribute to their villages. So as far as human capital is concerned, we do have such resources. For example, Vietnam, created a big database on migrated Vietnamese professionals and use them for their country development. So it's the same role model I'm trying to cover here, and especially promoting the science courses and science curriculum in the rural area. So this is through our we have a NGO called dharmahera.com, as well as the research wing of one. So through these two, we are heavily working on the interns of the students who are doing class 11, class 12, and also the bachelor degree, who come from rural end. So blend their courses, they are either into management or social science, and give them additional courses on technology, so that they can start appreciating the concept of science. So this is happening. This is what I have to say. And I would like to really add one more point, that there is a lady who has been selected to give a study on 5G network. She's wonderful technical personality, and what she told me was, 5G network study kahan se shuru kare? Where do I begin with? I think people are ministries and all these consultants are working in silos. Wish she was here to listen to this session. She could have captured so much, for her 5G. So even World Bank has to teach that now everybody has to be integrated, not work in silos. I think that is also a bit, how do you word it in this presentation? Some coverage on that I would like to see. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me for this. And this is the first time I'm attending this. And I'm very, very passionate to work in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yemi. Really appreciate it. I'm just conscious of the time. we are running out of time. I would very much like, I don't want to cut the flow, but at the same time, I'm cognizant of the time, and I know that Lada may want to stay on or would like to make a few quick remarks if she has to leave. And then we will still continue to do a few more comments before we end, but we just have kept on going. So Lada, do you want to come on at this point? Because I know that your time is very tight, and I'd really like you to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I really appreciate that. And the conversation is so interesting that I don't want to leave, but I'm already 15 minutes late for another meeting in which I asked that they start with Sri Lanka so I can still join there. So if you would allow me to do closing remarks before the closing, and unfortunately missing the end. Everyone, I do not know all of you. I've met some of you, and I look forward to meeting more of you as in the coming months. Again, my name is Lada Strelkova, and I'm the operations manager in the World Bank office in Nepal. And the discussion has been fascinating. I'm really happy that I had to do closing remarks, not opening remarks, because with opening remarks, I probably will have had to leave right after that. But I've joined the event to share some views on behalf of the country office management in Nepal. And it was meant to be sort of closing the event, but I think that it can contribute to the discussion at this point. And of course, first and foremost, a big thank you to the expert for participating in today's discussion and for joining the World Bank's effort to leverage technology for improved local service delivery in Nepal. This is really critical for the bank, for our support, for the bank's support to the government in building back better for greener and more inclusive and resilient society. And this is what we are trying to achieve. This is what we have been strategizing and discussing with the government that we need to do following up to in response to the COVID pandemic. And talking about COVID, needless to say, COVID-19 has had an enormous impact on the human capital in Nepal and has underscored the importance of leveraging technology to lessen the impact of the crisis. For example, as a result of school closures, it is expected that the learning adjusted years of schooling, a measure that combines the quality and quantity of schooling, will drop from 6.9 years before the pandemic to 6.4 years. And that's an enormous drop. To protect learning in the face of school closures, the government of Nepal rolled out learning programs using radio, television, online platforms. They have also disseminated offline learning materials to students. And we at the World Bank have supported some of these and other efforts through our ongoing engagements. And while significant, well, these efforts are significant, there are many households, especially those from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds, that do not have access to radio, to TV, to internet, and this prevents them from accessing these learning programs and highlighting the importance of ensuring technology is accessible to all. Even before the crisis, we at the World Bank were already working with the government and other partners on using technology to improve service delivery. For instance, we are currently supporting the government to develop the foundations of a social registry that will help to identify all potential beneficiaries of selected social programs, and thereby will improve the coverage of those programs, and will also improve coordination and interoperability of core government programs, such as, for instance, civil registration, national ID, and other similar ones, and will thus increase the efficiency of the programs. the social registry will also improve resilience and future preparedness, as the government will be able to quickly identify and provide support to those Nepalis affected by the next impending next crisis. And there will always be a next crisis. So in addition, we have also been supporting the government of Nepal through our education and sector programs to strengthen delivery systems and improve the effectiveness and efficiency of health and education services at the local level. So these are just several examples that I wanted to share, just something that we have already been working and will continue working. And moving forward, we will continue working with the government and with other partners to accelerate human capital, including through the use of technology. And indeed, technology will be one of our main areas of engagement in the country going forward, as evidenced by the inclusion of the focus on digital technology as a key strategic shift in our ongoing performance and learning review of the country partnerships framework for Nepal. With regard to human capital, we consider that technology can help local governments to deliver services more effectively and more efficiently, provided, of course, that they are equipped and trained on the usage of relevant technology systems and tools, including software for tracking expenditures and the delivery of quality services, ICT to enable remote learning for government staff and for children and for youth in schools, etc. All these aspects of work will be reflected in an innovative project that we are currently developing, that is currently under preparation. It's called the Human Capital Project. And we are preparing that project jointly with the government. And we also have a pipeline of follow-up operations in health, education, and social protection. And for all of those, we will be capturing elements of technology development, probably more than we would have done so before COVID-19. Finally, we hope to support the government in ensuring human capital, not only the accumulated human capital, but also the human capital in the labor markets through interventions that improve the employability of current and future Nepalis, including in the ICT sectors. So these were some of the thoughts that from a country management perspective, we thought would contribute to this conversation. And this conversation is an ongoing one as we understand it. And as you know, this workshop will be the first of a series of virtual conversations that will bring together a wide range of stakeholders to discuss, among other things, how technology can be used to deliver health, education, social protection services in Nepal. And we look forward to continue working with and benefiting from your guidance in the process, the guidance of experts like you today. And once again, thank you so much, everyone, for the very interesting discussion that I felt privileged to be able to listen to you today. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lada. Thank you so much for your remarks. In the interest of time, I suggest that we just have two last comments now. One from Dr. Alok Bohra, who's been patiently waiting, apologies, from New Mexico, and then from Mr. Ramacharya. And then we will have our final closing remark from our Executive Director, Dr. Vishwas Kauchan, after which we will close. So thank you so much, and Dr. Alok Bohra, kindly proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. My dog is in fact very impatient waiting for me to take him out for a walk. So anyway, it's a very fascinating discussion. I'm very glad that the World Bank has and the Iids put together this, this talk. And it is very close to my heart about like 12 years ago, I read an article called Using Technology to Fight Poverty. And inspired by that, I wrote a piece called Smart Technology. And then with Easy Mode and the Rotary Club, some of the students and myself and other colleague went to Nepal, and we wanted to create a smart village, right? With IT, e-library, everything. The only thing we could do was put a rain harvesting little thing there, and the rest is history. But over time, I'm an economist, and I agree with Dr. Arniko Pandey's comment about how and why social science needs to be part of this technology discussion. It has to be. And increasingly over the last about like 5 or 6, 7 years, I've begun to use biomarker science tool into my research. And so it's not just the opinion and the survey as most economists do, but I try to bring a lot of technological tools, whether that's from the health perspective. But what I wanted to do, give kind of a get our speakers comment, or maybe think about it down the road if you don't have time, is to think of this as I call it exponential technologies, right? So exponential technologies, definition might be slightly different, but not that different from convergent technologies, except the fact that this Moore's law, which advances the speed like every 18 months, and you have like 3D printing, artificial intelligence, now sort of a technology is not just the hardware, but it's been used in services, transportation, health, and even machine learning and the data sciences. So it is really exploding very rapidly. So I would like to mention about like 5 points for you to sort of think about. One is, yes, the technology has been democratized. There's a massive democratization with the speed and the technology. So that, you know, every something that used to be very expensive and only available to high-end researcher is now everyone can do that, right? Even like a finding, you talk about the exoplanets or even gene editing, there are lots of citizen science happening. So that's the democratization is very good. But what I worry as a social scientist and from a political economy perspective is, have you thought of the security? That's one. And then ethical issues. And then the third is, I talk a little bit of a inequality moral. And finally, the political implications. The first one is being the security issues is like synthetic biology. So whole science has become so cheap and available online. Do you worry about such a synthetic biology getting out of hand and creating viruses, spreading pandemic down the road? The other one is the 3D weapons, right? So you can do the 3D online to create weapons, okay? Those are the security concerns. The second one is the ethical concern that I kind of worry about a little bit is about the gene editing, right? So that technology, gene editing, facial recognition, profiling. So that's kind of and also data privacy about your health. And the third is of course, everybody has talked about the within as well as between country inequality. I don't need to sort of talk about that. We already have covered that. And the fourth point is the political implication. So for example, due to technology displacement of and the automation displacement of workers, like we saw in the US, like how the Midwest, you know, kind of a rebel in terms of political implication, right? With the unemployed workers. So, and then looking forward, as the AI, artificial intelligence creates sort of automations, a lot of people lose jobs, especially in the service sector. So do you think some sort of a UBI would be an answer? Or do you think some sort of an alternate human ingenuity, like if the technology is covered by the AI and the robots, what the people will do? Do we do more arts and music, you know, to create value for the people? And the final point I have is, how do you redefine convergence of technology, right? I thought the convergence of technology, for example, Amazon. If you look at Amazon, it used to be just selling books. Now, Amazon does behavioral thing and cloud computing. It does a lot more than just selling books. So that kind of a convergence of technology is also emerging in the field. So anyway, these 5 points, for whatever it's worth, I wanted to share with you all, and would love to hear your comment on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Ramacharya now, please, kindly.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, and thank you for the very nice presentation and discussion to everyone. Yeah, you presented nicely a scheme kind of thing, how technology develops and technology entry points, having your 9 points. It's quite interesting, but I think at the same time, it's very generic to me. I'm an economist. I work in Canada. You know, when we talk about this technology, we sometimes overlap or with this thing. Now, when we talk about the South Asia, because this is a human development issue in South Asia, the presentation, I will focus on this topic. Now, there are tremendous things technology can do. That's not what we're talking about. I think how we can adapt the technology that is available today will be available tomorrow in South Asia region. That region where 1/5 of the population are in better hospital and better private school, and 80% of them are completely segregated, completely separate schools where there is an elite boycott for reasons. They don't go to the same hospital, 80% go somewhere else, 20% go somewhere else. This is the situation, and it more and more, I'm hearing that in Nepal, there has been no classes for the last 1 year in the public school. And this digital advancement will provide more disturbances in the community, more divide, wider divide in the community. Now, I think as a World Bank, I would appreciate what is the country's specific characteristic in the South Asia, in that region, where it is a low, very low in Human Development Index. What needs to be done? Where should we enter the first in your 9 points? Where is the return highest? And we need a policy convergence. Where should the intervention should be? What sectoral intervention we should bring together? For example, education, health, digital infrastructure, and digital adoption. Those, I think, at least 4 of those bringing together. And I think at some point we like World Bank to address those issues at a country-specific level. What is different from Nepal? What is the situation? What is the policy we need? Government does or do not, but what is the best idea we can give? What intervention we should invite government to do? So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acharya. I know that Sumana had her hand up at some point, but I think we don't have time for seconds, unfortunately. I think we will have other opportunities later on. We are planning a more discussion at the provincial level with maybe mayors and others, and we are strategizing on that, building on a lot of this wealth of comments that are coming up. Presentations and discussions will happen more at the local levels. And then subsequent to that, that might give a lot more meat for the World Bank and the government and the provincial level authorities to think about what might be actually be these entry points and areas to focus on going forward. Implementation, management gap, this was mentioned, all of this critically important. So we need to really think about how anything we cook up actually gets delivered and delivered well and fast on the ground. Critically important. I just want to give the floor back to Sajitha and Klaus for just 1 minute each, after which I will ask our executive director to make his closing remarks.
Well, actually, Arun, I think I would just acknowledge the comments and just say that I think, of course, social science has to be part of the technology solution. I'm also an economist. I mean, most of the people on our team were not technology specialists at all. And we, in fact, make a very strong point that technology is embedded in the socio-political system, and that's how it gets used. And a lot of the things we talk about is precisely about what is not usually considered as technology entry points, like trust and community empowerment and building local capacity and so on. We actually feel that because of the convergence of technologies and because of the fact that innovation is currently being led by, big companies, the big global, in fact, tech companies, in fact, you need a countervailing measure to build that capacity at the local level. And in terms of the entry points, I mean, what we call the essential and cross-cutting, I mean, is exactly that. If you don't have digital access, then you are going to be excluding people from making use of these technologies, whether it's in agriculture or it's in education or whatever. What usually happens is that the platform is designed somewhere, without thinking like how people at the end point, whether it's the teacher or whether it's the student or whatever, how they're going to use it. And in fact, you have to flip the design if you really want to make use of, let's say, even just the digital technologies. And you need to put in this framework of protecting the most vulnerable and those who are excluded as part of your design and not as an afterthought, because that's so essential to making sure that this is the recovery of human capital to face new challenges. Over to Klaus.
And I don't have much to add. I mean, from the way our colleagues in human development are approaching this, the next 2, 3, 5 years will be, we will see a huge explosion of focus on technology, on climate change, and on human development. I think in some way, this is the start of this conversation. I think you have raised a lot of really urgent issues that go well beyond just setting out a strategy. I think from our point of view, the points that Sajitha made in terms of think very clearly about some of the value biases that you may not always have on top of your mind when you start thinking about developing human capital. I think data protection, data privacy, data literacy, the way the government actually thinks about articulating and implementing its strategy together with the private sector, I think these are all questions that go well beyond technology. Those are really questions that go deep into the political economy of a country and how the spoils and how the business models are being set out are absolutely critical. I've heard a number of examples of COVID-19 in Nepal, where basically the technology was the easy part. The hard part was to actually deliver this to rural areas, to come up with sort of ways that could be scaled up to use some of these pilots that have been tried and really debrief them and scale them up. So I think this is the moment where a lot of these decisions really are relevant for much broader discussion. I think I've heard a lot that we can use and build into our next presentation, the discussion with local governments and mayors in 4 weeks' time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus. Just prior to our executive director, if Renee is still there and you want to have a quick comment, Renee. Okay, he's probably dropped off. Dr. Biswas Kauchan, kindly your closing remarks, and then subsequent to that, we end. Thank you so much for all your participation.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Let me begin my closing remarks by thanking the World Bank for collaborating with Iids in hosting this very important workshop on human capital acceleration in Nepal through strategic deployment of converging technologies. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Sajitha and Mr. Klaus from the World Bank for their illuminating presentation on converging technology revolution with some specific reference to Nepal. It's fascinating to foresee how by converging different technologies, can it be possible to revolutionize the way we do things and reshape the human capital ecosystem in the future. The theme of this workshop is particularly significant as the policymakers around the world are becoming more resilient about the prospects of digital and greener economy in the midst of the worst scarring impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the lives and livelihoods of the people around the world and the broader economy. The key development challenges that Nepal faces, such as poor human capital, social exclusion, poor governance, poor institutional capacity, and low level of productivity, to name a few, can be addressed to a great extent by the increased adoption of advanced and integrated technologies, as we discussed today. Landlockedness, together with difficult terrains, has further posed unique and critical development challenges to the country. The technological advancement that will help in minimizing the burden of these enduring challenges will be crucial in achieving accelerated development in the country. I believe that landlocked developing countries like Nepal can benefit disproportionately by investing in the right mix of technologies. As the presentation highlights, data is the central to the converging technology revolution as it allows integration of data from the human, physical, biological, and cyber fields. The pandemic has, however, exposed the poor institutional capacity of both public and private sectors in Nepal to produce timely and reliable data, which are essential to assess its impact on people's life and the economy. It has greatly handicapped the private sector and the government in assessing and responding effectively to the pandemic, particularly in reaching out to the most vulnerable groups and the sectors. We believe that the use of converging technology will be helpful in overcoming these critical development challenges. Finally, I would like to thank IIDS Chair Dr. Wakle and all the distinguished panelists representing different sectors for taking out time to participate and contribute to this very important discussion. I would like to especially thank Dr. Arun Joshi, Director of Center for Human Access, IIDS, for coming up with the idea of organizing and moderating this very crucial workshop. Before I conclude, I would like to thank you all for your participation and making this workshop successful. The outcome of the workshop in a form of a summary document will be posted on our social media platforms. Last but not the least, I would like to thank my colleague at IIDS, Binisa Nepal, for coordinating the whole event. Thank you very much and please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very enriching session.